Hello, my name is Mark. I am the author of all literary works presented on this channel, Dramas, Dreams, and Drollery. I offer my plays, poems, and short stories free of charge, but please remember that I retain the copyright to all of them. Today's story is quite unusual in that its central character is non-human. You will see how a tree can have a profound impact on the lives of human beings. Set in a southern city during the 1960s, this tale concerns, among other things, the struggles of African Americans for equal rights, a story very appropriate for the America of 2020 with its Black Lives Matter demonstrations. All right, here is Old Maggie. In the early 18th century, while in England, James Oglethorpe laid out the plat of Savannah, Georgia. By giving the city rectilinear street crossings at right angles, he hoped to create a simple, orderly world for settlers, many of whom had known in the old world only poverty, disorder, and debtor's prison. But man finds little comfort in geometric regularity. So the first inhabitants of Savannah tried to soften the rigidity of the array by planting trees, bushes, and flowers beside their shelters. Entire squares were reserved as public parks. In time, these amenities made the city a model of tranquility and grace. Less than a mile from the municipal center stood Templeton Square, an exceptionally attractive locale. Small in size, it harbored only 4 residences, one at each of the cardinal points. As Savannah prospered and expanded, the original houses were replaced by larger and more elegant structures. By the 1850s, the homes on Templeton Square, all in the colonial or Greek revival styles, enjoyed the reputation of being among the finest residences of the city. Despite the grand and imposing nature of its man-made adornments, Templeton Square was most noted for a magnificent natural element, an enormous magnolia grandiflora that filled the space between the houses. It was so large and wondrous that visitors to the square often failed to recognize the grandness of the adjacent homes. The people of Savannah gave it an affectionate name, Old Maggie. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, Templeton Square suffered a marked decline. Fortunes of residents were lost and properties were neglected. Peeled paint and sagging rafters betrayed the hardship of its inhabitants. But outsiders who ventured into the square did not always note this adversity, for their eyes, like those of predecessors, were fixed upon the magnificent tree. On New Year's Day, 1964, by which time the square had regained some of its prosperity, the Hoskins family occupied the house on the south side of the square. Legal title to the property belonged to 87-year-old Caleb Hoskins, whose ancestors had possessed it for 5 generations. Living with him were his son Stanley, Stanley's wife Edna Sue, and their 2 children, Bo and Joanne. Caleb was an anachronism. Not only were his roots deep in the Savannah past, his mind dwelled there too. An unreconstructed rebel, Grandpa was still fighting the Civil War. He detested all Yankees, carpetbaggers, scalawags, and Negroes who didn't know their place in society. More modern and flexible in their outlook, Stanley and Edna Sue considered Caleb to be an embarrassment. They humored him as best they could and tried to steer him away from trouble. Fortunately, the old man rarely left the house, and he knew nothing about the people living on the opposite side of Old Maggie. The dwelling on the north side of Templeton Square housed a Jewish family, transplanted New Yorkers who had moved in only 2 months earlier. Political and social liberals, Arnold and Miriam Kramer, had lived in the North in complete contentment until a doctor diagnosed Miriam with a serious respiratory ailment and recommended a southern clime. They selected the beautiful antebellum architecture of Savannah over the modern construction of Fort Lauderdale, much to the chagrin of their children, Levi and Esther. Preston and Renee Trent, occupants of the home on the east side of the square, were also admirers of Savannah's architecture. People call them struggling artists. In truth, their struggles were artistic, not financial. Born into affluent families, the couple had ample material means to sustain themselves. With no children, the Trents owned a house much too large for their personal needs. It was theirs simply because it resembled the homes in which they had been raised, and it contained a wonderful studio with a large bay window. In sharp contrast to the Trents were the Metzgers, who lived on the west side of Templeton Square. Although John Metzger had a good job with a firm that exported lumber products, he and his wife Nina were heavily in debt. This pair had expensive tastes and weak resistance to impulse buying. Their solution to every purchasing decision was to add more burden to the credit card account. Through years of refinancing loans, they'd managed to keep the beautiful home in which they lived with their 3 children, Beverly, Joey, and Phil. Now, with property taxes in arrears, the Metzgers feared that January 1, 1864, marked the beginning of the year in which they would become homeless. Domestic strife rose as financial pressure mounted. Templeton Square was unusually serene on New Year's morning. Of its 16 residents, only 2 stirred before 9 a.m. Nina Metzger arose in the darkness in order to be at Darcy's when its New Year's Day sale began at 6. Grandpa Hoskins sat on the front porch swing at dawn, binoculars in one hand and a notepad in the other, in order to watch the birds in Old Maggie. A lifelong hunter, he had given up that sport a decade earlier for this more sedentary pastime. Feeling cold and hungry after 2 hours of bird watching, Caleb went inside to make himself some breakfast. The noise he manufactured rummaging about awakened Edna Sue. Knowing Grandpa's inept ways of food preparation, his daughter-in-law hurried downstairs as much to protect her kitchen as to aid the old man. Yawning as she worked, Edna Sue soon had eggs and bacon cooking in a skillet while Caleb drank coffee. "So, what did all of you do last night? I guess I fell asleep pretty early." "Oh, Stanley helped you to get to bed about 8, and then we made some popcorn and sat around watching a DVD until 10:30. The kids insisted they wanted to stay up until midnight. You know how they are. But both of them fell asleep before 11. After putting them in bed, Stanley and I sat in front of the fireplace, drinking wine until the magic hour. That's about it. We were in bed before 1. Not terribly exciting." "Doesn't have to be exciting. It was still fun, wasn't it?" "Sure." In his bathrobe, Stanley staggered into the room saying, "Where's my coffee?" He kissed Edna Sue on the cheek and sat at the table beside his father. "Haven't been up that late in a while. How was the bird watching this morning, Dad?" "Nothing unusual. Mostly mockingbirds, robins, and chickadees. Did see a yellow-shafted flicker, though, They generally stay out in the open country. Edna Sue served Grandpa his breakfast. I'll have yours in just a minute, Stanley. Did you bring in the newspaper? Not yet. Stanley fetched the paper and returned to the breakfast table. While drinking coffee, he remarked, "The president's going to give the State of the Union address soon. Wonder what he'll say." With a scowl on his face, Caleb observed, "Oh, that Johnson. He'll say something nice about the colored people, about how they're suffering and how we got to do something for 'em. He's a traitor in the South. That's what he is." "Hush, Caleb, that's not fair. The man's been in office only a little more than a month. Give him a chance." "Edna Sue's right, Dad. You were mighty glad to see Kennedy go." "Well, I didn't say I was glad to see the man die. I was happy to get rid of a Yankee Democrat, but I didn't want to put in his place a Southern Democrat who acts like a Yankee. When you start passing laws for black people, they feel high and mighty as if they're something special. Look at that Martin Luther King with his March on Washington. In my day, we knew how to put folk like him in their place." "Times are changing, Caleb. We need to be open-minded." "Bah! Don't hand me any of that bull. Colored people are inferior people, and no law's going to change that." In the afternoon, Grandpa played checkers with Bo. "Bo, in school you don't hang around with any colored folk, do you?" "No, sir." "Good. You know they're dumb people and can't be trusted." "Yes, sir." "Good boy, that's what I like to hear." On the north side of Templeton Square, all the Kramers arose about 9:30. As a family, they had stayed up until midnight. Now they were enjoying a breakfast of lox and bagels. Arnold and Miriam read the newspaper during the meal. "What do you think, Miriam? Will Johnson carry on Kennedy's program?" "Well, why should you doubt that? He said he would, and he's a man who knows how to get bills enacted into law." "It's still hard to believe that Kennedy's gone. I really miss him. He's a person I trusted." "I know, me too. But Johnson may surprise everyone. I wonder how long it will take this Warren Commission to complete its work." "Probably a long time. New things keep coming out about the assassination every day." "Do you think Oswald really might have been a communist agent?" "Who knows? How are you feeling today, Miriam?" "Oh, not too bad. I'm breathing a little easier. Maybe we could walk on the beach this afternoon so you can get fresh air." The weather's pretty cold. Maybe another time." Scarcely noticing the cold, Nina Metzger burst excitedly into her bedroom about 10 a.m. "John, look what I got," she shouted. Her sleeping husband awoke suddenly. "It's a cloisonné amphora. Isn't it beautiful? I'll bet there's not another like it in the whole South. It'll look wonderful on the entry table by the front door." How much did you pay for it?" "Well, it was a bargain." "So how much did the bargain cost?" $595. $595? Are you crazy? We can't afford to throw away money like that." "I was afraid you'd be unreasonable." "Unreasonable? We're about to lose the house, and you're buying expensive decorations for it? I'll bet the amphora's worth twice what I paid for it. What I've really done is to increase our net worth." "Take it back at once." "Oh, I don't want to. Besides, I can't. There are no refunds on today's sale items. You don't have to worry. I didn't pay cash. I just put it on the credit card." "But we're already at the limit of that card. And do you know the interest rate on the card is 23%? "Well, I read recently in a magazine that objets d'art are increasing rapidly in value. Why, who knows how much that amphora might be worth by next year?" "Yeah, we can enjoy that thought as we sit on a park bench with all our belongings in paper sacks. As I recall, you bought a new set of golf clubs just last week. Well, that's different. I play golf with business clients. I have to have a good set to play with. Playing golf gets me more business. Besides, I'm going to write off the clubs on our taxes. So you see, I'm actually saving us money. While the Metzgers were saving money, the Trents on the east side of the square, who had more money than they could spend, slept soundly. They had been with friends until 3 a.m., enjoying the New Year's celebration at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. Arising from bed about 11, they discussed the day's activities. Preston, what are you doing today? I'd like to work on my painting. Oh, this is a holiday. Can't we relax a little? Well, we artists are not daily employees. We work when we're inspired. Today I feel like painting. Okay, but aren't you tired from last night? Sure, but I'm anxious to get to work. There are things I want to do in this painting that I haven't tried before. This could be my masterpiece. I've heard you say that before, but who am I to hamper genius? Don't make fun of me. I'm not. I mean it. I truly believe you are a great artist. You have much more talent than I. One day you'll be famous. Then why don't my paintings sell? And why do the critics always complain that my works are too dark and gloomy? El Greco's View of Toledo and Rembrandt's Night Watch are two of the greatest pieces ever painted, and yet they could certainly be described as dark and gloomy. Very soon, all the residents of Templeton Square, not just the Trents, would talk at length about the subject of dark and light. Nature was preparing for them a special New Year's surprise. Old Maggie, that majestic icon of the community, had come to the end of its natural life. Almost precisely at noon, aided by a strong breeze, the mighty magnolia came crashing down with an explosive roar upon the home of the Metzgers. Instantly, the entire square and much of Savannah knew that a calamity had befallen their city. Emergency trucks and residents on foot rushed to the scene. By some miracle, none of the Metzgers had been killed or injured. Yet, most of the house had been destroyed. Within an hour of the disaster, crews of workmen began to cut up the carcass of the dead queen and to cart away her remains. Regrettably, there was no single place to receive the limbs and leaves, for it seemed fitting to reserve a site to memorialize this regal being. Even without obsequies, old Maggie was mourned for weeks on doorsteps and in the press. Although all of Savannah felt the loss of the stately tree, the residents of Templeton Square were directly and deeply affected, especially the Metzgers. Spurning an offer of temporary refuge in the home of the Trents, John and Nina, through their homeowner's insurance policy, chose provisional residence in rooms at the downtown Barker Hotel. In their new abode, they cursed their bad luck, and then each, in increasingly virulent terms, blamed the other for the misfortune. When they were on the verge of separation, John had a sudden inspiration. The mishap was not at all their fault. Others had caused it, and others must pay. The obvious scapegoat was the city of Savannah. If the city had maintained old Maggie properly, the tree would not have collapsed on their property. Along with compensation for the loss of their home, the city should pay damages for emotional distress. Expensive lawyers promised to win them a handsome remuneration. The demise of old Maggie affected the households of Templeton Square differently. Only the Metzgers viewed it as an opportunity for financial gain. To the Hoskins family, it represented the loss of a precious part of their heritage and the end of Grandpa's bird watching. For the Kramers, removal of the tree was akin to someone stripping them naked. They were exposed to the view of Southerners among whom they felt uneasy. The destruction of Las Meninas could not have caused the Trents more anguish than the passing of old Maggie. To the artist, both were great works of art, one by man and one by God. Henceforth, the world would be less beautiful. During the first week, POM, that is, post-old Maggie, the most flustered resident of Templeton Square, aside from the Metzgers, was unquestionably Caleb Hoskins. The departure of the tree had put an end to his bird watching, which for several years had been virtually his raison d'etre. A creature of habit, he continued to rise early with binoculars in hand. There were few birds in the square now, but he scanned the air and ground as intently as before. Stanley and Edna Sue tried to steer him in new directions. They recommended hobbies like woodworking or model plane building, but the old man refused to relent. About a week post POM, Caleb's focus turned from birds to the house across the square. In the OM era, with the tree obscuring his view, he had scarcely given a thought to it. Now he began to wonder about its occupants. Each morning, just before he went to breakfast, Grandpa noticed the man across the square fetching the newspaper. There was something peculiar about that man, he surmised. Maybe it was the cut of his clothing. Maybe it was the way he walked. At any rate, he didn't seem like a true Georgian. Grandpa asked Stanley and Edna Sue, but they knew nothing about the neighbor. It was fortunate for Caleb that he ventured outdoors with his binoculars only at dawn and dusk. Otherwise, he would have noted important changes in the open area where old Maggie had stood. Until the city council could decide its fate, that space lay open and fallow. Into the vacuum poured the children of the neighborhood. Not just the kids from houses on the square, but kids from blocks far away. Caleb would have been horrified to witness two black children mixing with Bo and Joanne. Stanley and Edna Sue knew, but they didn't mind. The Kramer children were there too, but their parents refrained from associating with their adult neighbors. Arnold and Miriam held a stereotypical view of white Southerners as narrow-minded bigots. They were living in the South simply to improve Miriam's health, not to assimilate a distasteful culture. During the first 2 months in Savannah, they had enjoyed a high degree of privacy. With old Maggie gone, their seclusion had vanished. The square was filled with children, and the houses on its perimeter seemed so near. 2 weeks POM, while fetching the morning paper, Arnold noticed an old man watching him through binoculars from the house across the square. He thought nothing of it the first time, but then he saw the old man the next day, and every day thereafter. Arnold began to feel paranoid. He told Miriam of his concern. The two speculated that the observer was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So Arnold bought a pair of binoculars. The artist didn't require optical instruments. POM, they were looking inward, not outward. With old Maggie no longer obscuring the sun, brilliant sunlight streamed through the bay window of their studio. Preston and Renee felt as if someone had removed cataracts from their eyes. Colors seemed more intense. Even blank canvases looked different. In this altered atmosphere, the Trents developed new concepts of art and adjusted their styles accordingly. By the 1st of February, Templeton Square had been transformed from a zone of staidness and placidity into a field of hyperactivity. The open space had become the preferred gathering spot of neighborhood children. Many parents wanted to convert it to a permanent playground, whereas most residents of the square wished to reestablish its beauty and tranquility. The Savannah City Council wrestled with the issue while fighting the legal action of the Metzgers, who continually sought to expand the lawsuit even as creditors pressed them for satisfaction of claims. Caleb Hoskins and Arnold Kramer were locked in a duel of binoculars. Through inquiry, Caleb learned that Arnold was a Democrat from New York, and Arnold discovered that Caleb was a rebel Republican. Each immediately ascribed to the other a sinister motive for surveillance. In the new environment, the Trents labored with feverish excitement at novel projects. Both felt that they were making great strides forward in their art. Preston exhibited 2 paintings at the Telfair Academy Museum and received lavish praise from local critics. Renee won accolades for work in sculpture, a medium new to her. No couple in Savannah enjoyed more happiness at this time. March began auspiciously for the Trents. Prenton sold a painting for $30,000, a personal record. The Atlanta Constitution featured Renee and 2 other painters in a series entitled Outstanding Southern Artists. Then the wheel of fortune swung the other way. Preston experienced a vision problem. The world seemed to be growing darker. At first, he attributed the condition to overwork, but the affliction persisted even with rest. Eventually, an ophthalmologist told him devastating news. Within a year, he would be totally blind. Neither drugs nor surgery could halt the degeneration. A specialist in New Orleans confirmed the diagnosis. During March, bad news came in bunches for the Metzgers. A furniture company to which they owed $6,000 was suing them for non-payment. The bank which held title to their home was warning of foreclosure. Property taxes were due in April. John and Nina responded by selling one of their 2 cars. Instead of using the money to pay down debts, they gave it to the lawyers with instructions to accelerate their lawsuit against the city. By April Fool's Day, husband and wife were battling one another for control of the family car. The coming of spring did not brighten the outlook for either Caleb Hoskins or the Kramers. In fact, all 3 were relying on Tom's antacids to get them through the day. The mere presence of an unknown visitor into the Hoskins residence sufficed to convince Miriam that the clan was plotting against them. On the mornings after such events, she scanned the front lawn expecting to see a burning cross. The view available to her through the same window every afternoon offered a sharp contrast to this fantasy. Happy children filled the square at that time. Among them, black siblings, Melanie and Lucius Johnson, played daily with the white Hoskins children. Afternoon naps kept Caleb ignorant of this activity until he was awakened one day in March by the ringing of a doorbell. With Stanley at work and Edna Sue at the store, Grandpa had to respond. Opening the door, he faced Joanne in tears. At her side stood Melanie Johnson. The black girl spoke very softly. "Excuse me, sir, but Joanne got hurt." The sight of a colored girl in the square troubled Caleb, but the condition of his granddaughter concerned him more. What happened to her?" the man asked. The shy girl replied, "A boy riding his bike knocked her down. He wasn't paying attention." Caleb could see blood on Joanne's leg. He and Melanie helped the injured girl to a seat in the kitchen. Then they propped the leg on a chair and cleaned the wound. By having Joanne move her limb, the old man satisfied himself that there was no fracture. With the matter settled, Caleb turned to Melanie. "Where do you live, girl?" "A few blocks away." "Well, you shouldn't be here. This is white folks' territory. There's no place to play where I live. All the kids are coming over here now. Well, you stay in your own neighborhood, you hear? Yes, sir. Despite her apparent concession, Melanie continued to play in Templeton Square. Her mother and other black parents told their children to play there. The city council endorsed this action by voting 4-3 to convert Templeton Square into a children's playground furnished with slides and swings. News of the decision infuriated Caleb Hoskins for a while, but his passion soon subsided as a more important matter occupied his attention. It was the relentless spying of that New York carpetbagger. The old man decided to settle the issue once and for all. Stanley and Edna Sue were doing nothing. They had been ignoring his warnings and threats. So early one morning, he got out the hunting rifle he hadn't used in years, loaded it, and strode firmly across the square just as the sun was rising. Hiding behind bushes, Caleb waited for the New Yorker to fetch his newspaper. At that moment, he leaped out into the open and pointed the gun at the foe. Startled, Arnold raised his hands as if surrendering. "What are you spying around here for?" "What do you mean? I'm not spying." "Yes, you are. You watch us all the time with those binoculars of yours." "Well, I got those binoculars because you were watching us with your binoculars. So why were you spying on us?" "That's none of your business. You won't talk, but I know you're up to no good. So I'm giving you a warning. Cut out the spying or else." "Or else what?" "You'll find out." With that, Grandpa returned to the house, feeling much better. He'd taught the Yankee a lesson. Miriam was terribly upset at the news of this confrontation. When Arnold suggested calling the police, she objected. Southern policemen were all Klan members. Calling them wouldn't help, and it might hurt. She advised her husband not to use the binoculars. Arnold didn't know what to do, but he heeded his wife's advice. The Metzgers got a warning too, a second notice from the bank regarding missed house payments. The news upset Nina so much that she promptly went out and purchased a new dress to make herself feel better. This notice bothered John less. By now he was thinking of abandoning the house. He and Nina had refinanced it 3 times, so their equity was small. But desperate for money, he called his lawyers to ask if he might win a suit against the insurance company that had offered inadequate compensation. The day after this phone call, John received in the mail from the city of Savannah a bill for $1,000. While working on the Metzger lawsuit, the city attorney had discovered in the original municipal charter a stipulation that property owners on the squares were responsible for maintenance of the trees in the open spaces. Inasmuch as the city had borne the cost of cutting up and carrying away old Maggie, Savannah now sought reimbursement for what was properly an expense of the homeowners. Preston Trent's burden was ocular, not financial. The deterioration of his eyesight seemed to be progressing more rapidly than doctors had estimated. By mid-April, the artist had made a painful decision. He would abandon painting in favor of sculpture. Painting was an art that required good vision. Sculpture was tactile. A blind man might do it. Once committed to the change, Preston worked hard to master the skills of the craft. He wanted to learn all that he could with his eyes before they failed him. Renee gave him good advice. The artist spent much of the month of May outdoors, away from the studio. He wanted to absorb as much of nature's beauty as he could. With Renee's help, he conducted several experiments. She would blindfold him and lead him to an object. He would feel it with his hands and describe it. Then, with the blindfold off, he would determine how closely his mental and verbal images corresponded to reality. During the final week of April, city workmen began installing new playground equipment in Templeton Square. More children than before converged on that place, especially in the late afternoon. Concerned about her son and daughter among the southern strangers, Miriam began to spend time in the square when they were outdoors. Edna Sue also ventured into the square when her children were there. New equipment and large numbers of users raised her concern about the safety of Bo and Joanne, especially after her daughter's injury. As a friendly gesture, Edna Sue initiated a conversation with Miriam one day. A little reticent at first, the New Yorker soon discovered that the woman across the street was a very pleasant person who harbored no prejudices against Northerners. By their third encounter, Miriam was looking forward to seeing Edna Sue. On the playground, other bonds were forming. Melanie and Joanne strengthened the link that had been established earlier. Bo and Levi discovered one another. Before summer vacation, they were calling each other best friends. By the time Grandpa found out, he realized the relationships could not be suppressed. Although he muttered to himself, he said little to others about his feelings. Across the South, the summer of 1964 became known as Freedom Summer. At many locales, black people demanded equality. Sometimes they clashed with intransigent whites. In Mississippi, bigots surrounded 3 young civil rights workers and ended their lives. Templeton Square stood in marked contrast to all that. It was an oasis of racial harmony. Preston Trent was making a smooth transition into a world without color. Except for the Metzgers and Caleb Hoskins, all the residents of the square seemed happy with themselves and with others. On June 20, Templeton residents had a small party in the playground. All were saddened to learn that the Metzgers had been arrested for insurance fraud. After losing their home and the suit against the city, the couple had faked an automobile accident in a futile effort to make money. The Trents, the Hoskins, and the Kramers discussed the news of the day, the Senate's passage of the Civil Rights Bill, and the increasing involvement of their country in Vietnam. Arnold spoke for the others when he expressed deep worry about the future of America. Edna Sue left them all with a comforting thought. She said, "The world is always full of troubles, but if we keep our hearts in the right place, we'll be all right." End of story. Amazing, isn't it, how the absence of one tree could affect major changes in the lives of many people? Sometimes things happen like that. On only one occasion in the 9 months history of this channel have I offered poetry. The next program, in mid-July, will mark the second presentation of that nature. Until then, thank you for watching Dramas, Dreams, and Drollery.